Shalom from the Israel desk. My name is Barry Segal, and greetings VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. Of course, we always appreciate every week that you stand with us and watch the VFI News. Now, it's been another exciting week in Israel, filled with good news, bad news, and news that could still go either way. We started with tragedy as a young mother was murdered on the road as she and her husband tried to get to the hospital to deliver another baby, but also included national elation as our representative at the Eurovision Song Contest won second place despite ugly protests. It also included the launch of Operation Gideons Chariots in the Gaza Strip, a final effort which we hope will lead to the return of our remaining hostages and a strategic defeat of Hamas. Hovering over all of this is the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran over that country's nuclear weapons program. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. We start this week's report with some sad news, as last Wednesday evening, Tze'ela Gez, a 30-year-old mother of 3 children, was shot by a terrorist as she was riding in a car driven by her husband. They were making their way to Beilinson Hospital in the central Israeli city of Petah Tikva so that she could deliver her 4th baby. Although critically wounded, Tze'ela managed to stay alive long enough for the staff at the hospital to deliver her baby and place him in the natal intensive care unit, where he remained in critical but stable condition for several days. His father was lightly wounded in the attack and will now have to raise his 4 children without their mother. So sad. This was only the deadliest of several terrorist incidents that took place in Israel over the past week, with others resulting in light wounds to police officers and ordinary citizens, while most of the attackers did not survive the return fire that was directed at them. This included the attacker who fired at Tze'ela Gez and her husband as he was tracked down by the security forces a few days later. And like many others who found themselves in a similar situation, he didn't want to be taken alive. So he wasn't. That's the sad end to this story. But the difficult story of his victims is just the beginning. So I'll ask you to join me in praying for them and for all Israeli families who never forget for one moment that something like that could happen to them. Now, on that subject, there are many other families in Israel who have suffered tragedy. Later in the report, we'll talk about the first IDF casualty of Operation Gideons Chariots, the renewed offensive against Hamas in Gaza. He is, I believe, the 916th IDF soldier to lose his life in this war. And there are about that same number of civilians who have lost their lives since October 7th. Many more have been wounded, and thousands more have been displaced from their homes for extended periods of time, and of those, especially in the north, quite a large number have discovered when they tried to go home that there was nothing to go back to. Hezbollah mindlessly fired anti-tank missiles and other weapons at homes, schools, medical clinics, and whatever other buildings they could see in border communities of northern Israel for months before Israel even launched a counteroffensive. Many of these communities have simply been reduced to rubble and ashes. Although, thank God, there were few lives lost, most of them had been evacuated in the early days of the fighting. Nevertheless, there has been tremendous suffering and upheaval in the lives of these people, and it's not going to end anytime soon. The economy of Israel is showing some signs of eventual recovery, but it will take several quarters of growth, if not years, before we even get back to the point where we were before the war started. A lot of people are out of work, and even many people who are working are not making enough money to make ends meet. I have friends who love this country very much, but they've had to leave in the last year because they simply can't afford the cost of living here. I know there are many more like that, and personally I believe this is part of the enemy's strategy to try and defeat the plans and purposes of God for these people in this country. It won't happen. That's why at Vision for Israel, we have projects to try and assist families in financial distress. We distribute grocery store vouchers, school supplies for children, and many other things that people need to live in dignity, or in some cases to simply live. So please watch this short video about our humanitarian aid relief projects. all know that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Welcome back, friends. Now, it wasn't all bad news for Israelis this week, as we got something to smile about from Yuval Raphael, who survived the October 7th attack on the Nova Music Festival in southern Israel by hiding under a pile of dead bodies in a crowded shelter. Now, that kind of experience would shake up anyone, and no one would blame Yuval if she never recovered from the trauma. But she did recover, and this last week, she traveled to Basel, Switzerland to represent Israel in the Eurovision Song Contest. Last year's contest was marred by anti-Semitic abuse directed at Israeli singer Eidan Golan, even though the contest was held just a few months after the October 7th attacks and anti-Israel protesters were still just getting organized. It was so bad that Eidan was confined to her hotel room for her own safety, only venturing out for official contest events, and even then under heavy protection. Well, this year, these protesters were fully mobilized and ready to make trouble for Israel's Eurovision entry at Basel. They certainly tried showing up to every event wearing white checkered keffiyehs and carrying Palestinian flags, harassing Yuval and other members of the Israeli delegation wherever they went. But Israel supporters also showed up in Basel, and the Swiss police did a great job of keeping everyone safe. There were some ugly confrontations between protesters from both sides and also some scuffles with police. But it did not stop the Israeli team and their supporters from enjoying the contest, and it might have even contributed to Yuval's popularity with voters. She ended up with the highest total number of call-in votes and came in second place overall, having secured a large number of votes from the professional judges as well. The winner of the event, an artist who goes by the name JJ, and represented the country of Austria, didn't have much to say one way or the other about Yuval's participation or her second-place finish. But since Austria presently is a friend of Israel and is somewhat neutral, that's fine. Switching to commentary mode, the hatred and opposition to Israel that we saw at this song competition in Switzerland is completely cuckoo, irrational. There were some who tried to make it sound rational by comparing Israel to Russia, which has been banned from the competition since launching an unprovoked invasion of neighboring Ukraine in February of 2022. But this is a false comparison, and everybody knows it. Israel's war against Iranian proxies is a defensive war that happened because we were attacked by one proxy, Hamas, and then all the others, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various Shiite militias operating out of Iraq and Syria, and finally Iran itself jumped in. Well, Israel struck back and annihilated Hezbollah, which indirectly led to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. This was a major double blow to Iran's regional strategy, and it is still unclear how it can recover from these twin disasters, not to mention the less dramatic but still important withdrawal, quiet though it may have been, of the Iraqi militias from this war. We haven't had a single drone or missile fired at Israel by those guys in months, although hardly anyone noticed, for better or for worse. That leaves the Houthis in Yemen. These clowns have been firing ballistic missiles at Israel at a rate of about 1 every 24 hours a day for months. And they've also tried to fire suicide drones at us, although those don't fly nearby as fast and can usually be detected and shot down long before they get anywhere close to Israel. Now, these attacks by the Houthis in Yemen are a strategic irritant, and they've caused some damage to the economy since many international airlines are reluctant to fly in and out of Ben Gurion International Airport. But militarily speaking, they're completely worthless and futile. Israel's counterattacks have done tremendous damage to Houthi-controlled infrastructure in Yemen, and the biggest losers in that situation are ordinary Yemeni people who depend on the ports to bring food and medicine into the country. The Houthis know this, and they also know that all they have to do in order to stop Israel from bombing these ports, the airport, factories, and other infrastructure, is to stop firing ballistic missiles at Israel. Make sense? Yes. As I already said, they should do that anyway, because those ballistic missiles are a complete waste of time. Well, this is like a man who is starving to death and also very ill, throwing rocks at a police car 100 meters away. There's zero chance that the rocks he's throwing will do serious damage to the car or hurt a police officer, and he'd be much better off using his energy to get himself to the hospital. But he keeps throwing the rocks even after a police sniper hits him with several shots. It's not a perfect metaphor, but you get the point? This is not rational behavior. In fact, it's utterly insane behavior, and it's not the only example of it. I think they're insane. Iran itself has so many internal problems, from a shattered economy to terrible environmental pollution, a long-term drought, and the list just goes on and on. The beat goes on and on, you know that song. But what does the regime that runs that country spend most of its time, effort, and money on it? It all goes towards attacking Israel and the Jews. It goes towards buying missiles for Hezbollah and the Houthis. It goes towards holding international Holocaust denial cartoon contests and so on. Friends, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This behavior reminds me of the last few months of World War II, when the Nazis were facing inevitable defeat, with the Red Army relentlessly advancing towards Berlin in the east, while the Americans and the British were advancing from the west and up through Italy from the south. There were no hope for the Germans to win the war at that point, or even to avoid being completely destroyed. The sensible thing for them to do would have been to surrender to the Western Allies in return for protection against the Soviets, and indeed many ordinary German soldiers and civilians tried to do just that very thing. But the regime refused to surrender, and instead focused all the remaining energy on murdering as many Jews as they possibly could, right up until the last moment. Their demonically inspired hatred of the Jews drove them to continue spending time and resources they couldn't spare them from the battles against regular armies, to hunting them down and executing helpless Jewish men, women, and children. Now listen, folks, 25% of my own family died in the Holocaust. I'm talking about a serious historical tragedy. That same thing is happening again today, and it's for the same reason. Nothing else but demonically inspired hatred can explain why so many people in Iran, Yemen, Gaza, Europe, America, Canada, Australia, and all over the world are focusing so much of their time and negative attention on this little country in the Middle East called Israel. There are literally dozens of active shooting wars going on all over the world. All kinds of actual atrocities and war crimes are being committed by rogue regimes, criminal syndicates, etc. And all of that is being ignored. It is not rational. It is not logical. It is simply not natural, and you all know it. It is supernatural, and it is inspired by Satan the devil, who hates everything that God loves. So if you call yourself a follower of Yeshua, also known as Jesus Christ, I urge you to get in this battle by praying for Israel, for your own pastoral leadership, and for the body of Messiah worldwide, especially in Israel, because we're at the tip of the spear, which, by the way, is what my name means. I believe Barry means tip of the spear. This is no time to save anything for later, friends. This battle is raging. The other side is firing on all cylinders, and the household of faith must do the same. Get in and get involved. Now, I know this bit of commentary went for longer than usual, but it was important to make the point. The next story also drives home the point, and I'm talking, of course, about IDF's launching of Operation Gideons Chariots. Whoa, I love that name. This renewed offensive will not be like previous rounds of fighting. This time the IDF is going in hard and will hold on to territory while moving the civilian population out of some areas where they know Hamas has built up infrastructure. This infrastructure and the terrorists who are manning it will be systematically demolished and eliminated. I can report to you that already in the first hours and days of this campaign, several of the remaining senior leaders of Hamas have been eliminated, including Mohammed Sinwar, the titular leader of Hamas. He and several of his senior deputies were taken out by an airstrike in Khan Yunis last week. It took a few days to identify the remains among the rubble, but we now have the confirmation that he's permanently out of the picture, out of action, and the world is a better place for it. But again, Hamas still refuses to give up and release the remaining hostages. Everyone, including the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, has told them that they need to release the remaining hostages so that Israel will no longer have a pretext to attack them. That's common sense, right? Just like it was common sense for the Germans to surrender to the Western Allies in 1944, but that's not what they're doing, and once again, I think the reason is spiritual. And by the way, none of the population in the Gaza Strip seems to be helping Israel also to release the hostages. Make a note of that, please. Now, there's another aspect to the Israeli operation in Gaza, and that is the renewal of food and medicine distribution into the Strip from Israeli territory. Those shipments were cut off by Israel a few months ago because Hamas was stealing most of the aid that got sent into the Strip, giving the best of it to its own people and selling the rest. Imagine selling our aid or your aid to the rest of the general Gaza population at massively inflated prices. Because this was assessed to be prolonging the war and thus the suffering of everyone in Gaza and also in Israel, it was decided to stop these shipments. The results were predictable. Soon, video and pictures of starving Palestinian children in Gaza started flooding the international media coverage, and of course, Israel was blamed with barely even a mention of Hamas. Well, predictably, there was soon immense pressure on Israel to allow trucks loaded with food and medicine to go into the Strip, regardless of who might actually get it once it was there. And this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu decided he could no longer say no to these demands. Too much international pressure, and of course from President Donald Trump in the United States. Several trucks did go in, and aid organizations almost immediately declared that it is impossible to distribute it to anyone because of the lawless conditions in the Gaza Strip. Of course, Israel is once again being blamed for this, with little or no mention of the part Hamas played in both creating and perpetrating this terrible situation. While the ludicrously absurd media bias in reporting on the conflict is, I think, also a spiritual issue. And I've been telling people for years that it's one more thing to be praying about. That is why it's so important to get the VFI news reports out. We're not about sensationalism. We're about the reality of what's taking place on the ground and looking at Scripture and praying together with all of you. Now, there is one really more big story this week, and it's kind of hanging over all the other stories. I am, of course, talking about the ongoing negotiations between American and Iranian diplomats regarding Iran's nuclear weapons program. On Tuesday, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei made a speech in which he said, among other things, that it is, quote, a big mistake for anyone to try and prevent Iran from enriching uranium. Regarding the talks, he said, we don't think it will lead to any outcome. We don't know what will happen. He added that the American side involved in these indirect negotiations should refrain from speaking nonsense. Who is talking here? Who does he think he is? Well, this was followed by a statement by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who said that Iran's uranium enrichment was a red line that America would not tolerate. The very next day, senior Iranian officials said one after the other that Iran would never compromise on uranium enrichment. Remember the red line? The next round of talks are tentatively scheduled for this coming weekend, and I, for one, am having a very difficult time understanding why. It has become hopelessly obvious that Iran is just stringing the Trump administration along, just as it has been stringing along U.S. administrations and the world for decades now. The experts all agree that Iran is very close to having the capability to produce not one but 6 working nuclear weapons. They already have ballistic missiles that can theoretically deliver a nuclear payload, although there is some engineering work they'd have to do before being able to fit a nuclear warhead onto a missile. But in all honesty, we've known for years that at some point we'd get to this juncture. Israel is trying to warn the United States that the time has come to stop wasting time playing the Iranian game and hit them with military strikes instead. This might be our last best chance to accomplish something meaningful with military strikes, as Iran's air defense network is still trying to recover from the Israeli strikes last October. Now, if the United States is worried about risking its strategic bombing fleet, which is the crown jewels of its global military posture, then the risk to these crown jewels will never be lower. I would add that there would almost certainly be very high public support for such a strike, and it would be a strong warning to China and others that although America might be going through a rough patch, Uncle Sam, Moshe, still has it where it counts. Well, now I've said before on this program that I'm under no illusions that this path will be easy. Although Israel has largely removed the threats on our immediate borders, especially in the north regarding Hezbollah, there is still a great danger to Israel in any direct conflict with Iran. We should be humble, even after the Iranian attacks from last April and then again in October that did not manage to do any serious damage to Israel. The incoming drones, cruise, and ballistic missiles were mostly shot down, and even those that got through the defenses were not as destructive as we'd been told they would have been. That's the good news. But the bad news is that these were not Iran's most powerful or sophisticated weapons. Nor is Hezbollah completely out of this game, although they've been greatly weakened and the Lebanese National Army is continuing to confront them and take back their country. Also, the al-Jolani regime in Syria seems to have a pragmatic side and are reportedly in quiet back-channel talks with Israel to try and keep some stability in this region, and also keep Iran from returning to Syria in force or use it to resupply Hezbollah. Once again, that's good news. But the bad news is that this regime does not yet have full control over all the jihadist groups in Syria. There are vast areas, especially in the eastern desert regions, which are essentially ungoverned spaces. Attacks on Israel by elements the regime has little or no control over and which are operating in these ungoverned spaces are not beyond the realm of possibility. So for all these reasons, Vision for Israel is continuing to install bomb safety shelters all over Israel. Just this week, we installed another 6, making us have over 428 bomb safety shelters all over Israel, to give residents, including Jews, Arabs, and others, the security they deserve. These shelters have already saved lives in this current war, and they will continue serving that purpose for many years to come. So please watch this short video about VFI's project to provide shelters for Israeli communities of risk from rocket and missile attacks. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. In Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, my friends, and I hope you give us a thumbs up and invite your friends to subscribe, please. We're not about sensationalistic titles. We're about bringing reality and the news to all of you out there, so I hope we're fulfilling that mandate. Well, anyways, we're coming near to the end of this week's report, and I want to quickly mention a few other stories that are making headlines this week. Sergeant Yosef Yehuda Shirak, 22 years old, became the IDF fatality of Operation Gideons Chariots, the first fatality, when he was hit by unfortunately friendly fire in northern Gaza on Monday. But that wasn't the only bad news for Israel to result from the renewed offensive, as the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, and Canada all said they were considering harsh economic sanctions if the operation continues much longer. In fairness, their joint statement also called for the release of the remaining hostages in an apparent acknowledgement that this is the reason the fighting is continuing. Other Western leaders who have tried to put pressure on Israel to stop the operation have not been so understanding, and of course Israel's many enemies have not even tried to be even-handed in their statements of condemnation for Israel's most recent actions. Now we've come to the end of this week's report, and I want to continue the tradition of ending with some positive news. U.S. air carrier Delta Airlines announced on Monday that it is resuming flights from New York to Tel Aviv, saying they've conducted an extensive security assessment and decided it's safe to start flying to Israel again. Hopefully other airlines will soon follow this example. Well, let's fly away, all of us together, with VFI News on next week's episode. Thank you for joining me this week in Israel. So until next week, this has been another VFI News Report, and I love you all, and please pray for me as I'm praying for all of you. God bless you, and shalom. Amen.